Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a moment. In the meantime, if you want to place in the chat where you're calling in from today, perhaps how you're feeling, just to get to know each other a little bit more, that would be wonderful. Okay, well, I'm going to just dive into the introduction because I know that we have a really full conversation today and I don't want to take anything away from that. So welcome to Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and Claire Bidwell Smith. My name is Derek Hosberg. I'm the program director here at Reimagine, which is a nonprofit that sparks community experiences like this one to face some of the hardest parts of our existence, like serious illness and death, while celebrating life and one another. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping and first off to give a huge thank you to the past and present sponsor Domani for Grief, which has been incredibly supportive of this program. I also wanted to thank the Reimagine sponsors for 2021 who helped make this work possible. And I also just wanted to make a call out to all of you who've donated to Reimagine to support free programming like this event. And I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with Zoom. We are going to do questions via chat. So we encourage you to please, put your questions, comments throughout the programming in the chat, and then we will have time at the end to explore those. And also to say that there should be a little CC at the bottom of your screen for closed captioning. I've enabled live transcription if you'd like to use that. And if the chat is being distracting, you can always just click the little X at the top under that arrow. We usually just mention this on the calls that, if you've shared where you're calling in from, we also invite you to share the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples that you are on as well. We do land acknowledgement to demonstrate our commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism. I am personally located on Muwekma, Ohlone, and Ramaytush territory. If you're interested in sharing where you're located, I will put a link to nativeland.ca and you can look that up. And with that, I am going to pass it off to Allison. And just for a little background for those who are new to Allison, she is an Emmy award-winning journalist and really one of the most thought-provoking and influential writers on grief and resilience. She's the author of numerous books, including Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive. Her stirring work exposes a secret and essential factor for harnessing loss to drive happiness and rebound from adversity. She serves on the board of directors for the National Alliance for Grieving Children and the advisory board for the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which is the preeminent national organization providing grief support to families of America's fallen heroes. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Allison.
Thank you so much, Dara. Thank you, Reimagine. And a special thank you, of course, to Domani for Grief, because without Domani for Grief, we would not be able to provide this kind of free programming. And it is my honor and really my pleasure to have my friend, Claire Bidwell Smith, join us today. We are a full house, and I have seen in the chat where everyone is chiming in from, and we are international. And I see folks from California to Miami up to Vermont and everywhere in between. And so welcome. I'm in New York. It is 1:05 here, and I promise we will get out on time. I will end precisely at 2:00 Eastern. And so if you have blocked this time for taking a break from kids, taking a break from work. If you have a lot of this time during your lunch hour and you really need to get back to it, I promise you, I will honor that. If at any point you do need to dip off, we are recording this conversation. And so you can always come back. And so there's no pressure. Logistics wise, I'm going to ask Claire some questions that are on my mind about grief and anxiety. And I hope that you are bringing your own questions as well. Christina is on the line as always. Raise, yes, thank you. Wave your hand. Christina is my partner in crime, and she's going to go through the chat where I would hope that you can make sure that your questions can be put. If you can make them as broad as possible, so more people than fewer people can have the benefit of Claire's insight, that would be super. If you don't want to ask a question in the chat because maybe it's too personal, again, please do a private message to Christina. Again, wave your hand, Christina, so folks can see you. Private message her, and then when it's time for the Q&A, she will then, of course, not attribute the question to you, and we can make sure that Claire or I can answer the question and concerns that you have. So those are the logistics. I also want to say that for the first time, we're going to do something a little bit unusual because it is Claire Bidwell Smith. Claire has this wonderful partnership with Domani for Grief, and she's just beginning a grief and anxiety course with Domani that will launch in August, on August 23rd. And so in a little bit, I'm going to give you a number to text. And when you text that number, you will not only be added to the Damani for Grief, I guess you call it a listserv or their list, but you will also get 10% off Claire's new grief and anxiety course. We've never done it before. We're not publicizing it. It's just for folks here on this call today to see how texting for a discount code off Claire's program works. You'll have to let us know if you like it, I guess. So we'll put that up in just a little bit. But I do want to dig in and just say, hi, Claire.
Hi, Allison. Thank you for having me. And thanks to Domani and Reimagine. I love being here.
Well, we love seeing you in your Reimagine series. And so we're just so thrilled. And I do want to talk and start right away with something which is brand new, is that CNN.com just interviewed you about grief and anxiety. And there's something that you said in that CNN.com piece that really struck me, which is, and it's so perfectly timed, by the way, to the Olympics. And so it's really about athletes and what we can learn from the best athletes when it comes to grief and anxiety. And you talk about using our imagination. And I just would love you to explain the linkages between athleticism and grief and anxiety and imagination.
That's an interesting question. So I talked about athleticism in reference to this dilemma that so many of my clients and people that I speak with experience when you don't get to say goodbye to a loved one. Either you don't get to say goodbye to them because of something like COVID and you weren't permitted to the hospital, or it was unexpected, or you didn't realize it was coming. And so many people that I sit with really struggle with this. I didn't get to be there. I didn't get to say the things I wanted to say. I didn't get to say goodbye. And, there's not a lot we can do. I think that if there's this finality that you feel when this has happened, like there's no way to go back and do this over. But I do think that what happened was I heard somewhere that a lot of athletes will picture their game or their run or whatever it is that's coming up, and they'll run the whole course in their minds, and their body has a very strong reaction to it, a physical reaction to it, and can sometimes create a muscle memory that carries on to their actual performance. And I was thinking about how remarkable that was. And so I started doing meditations for myself and with my clients where we do go back and say goodbye. We do have that goodbye that we want to have. personally, I wasn't there when my mother died, and I've gone back many times and I've made it in time in my head, to be there with her in her hospital room and crawl into bed with her and put my arms around her and say this goodbye that I wanted to say. And I think there's something very soothing about it, for myself, maybe in a spiritual, soulful way, but also even in just a physical way, that I think about when I think about those athletes. So that's what that was in reference to.
I love it because I think that if you imagine that run, if you imagine that pitch, if you're a pitcher, you're imagining the strikeouts, if you're imagining that goodbye with your mom, I could see, at least for me, how that could kind of lower the anxiety that I might feel having not have had that opportunity. So I feel like that really struck me. And you just brought up your mom, and I do want to talk about something very personal that you've written about, Claire, which is that your mom died when you were 18 and your dad died when you were 25. You and I share a very similar um, path in terms of our young adult losses. You were 18, a teenager. And your mother struggled to accept that she was dying. And so there was a lot of, I guess, friction for you over the long term about how to cope with that. You have said that you didn't get to say goodbye, you didn't get to talk about it. And then here is a quote that I thought was very moving about how this has left you feeling. And you say, even 25 years later, there are so many things I wish I could go back and ask my mom. I want to know what her teens were like, who her favorite teacher was, her first kiss, her best friend when she was 30, and what she imagined for my life and what she thought happens when we die. And then to contrast that with your father, who, from what you've described, was a much more different, welcoming, warm passing where you got to be there, where he was welcoming of hospice and all that goes with it at the end. And I'm wondering for you, how does that death experience that you've experienced two very different processes impact our experiences then going forward of our own anxiety? So death experience and how we experience anxiety as a result.
Yes, my parents' deaths were very different. My mother was sick. They both got cancer at the same time when I was 14. I'm an only child, so it was this kind of heavy thing looming over all of us, all through my adolescence into my 20s. And my mother died when I was a freshman in college. And she really had not faced that the end was coming in multiple ways. I think her own denial, I think her own fear, but on some part too, I think there was a part played by the medical community around her, who just kept offering like thing after thing we could try. And she wanted to try them. She wanted to live, but so many of those were really, either they were going to prolong her life for only a short period of time, or they were going to make her life very difficult. At one point she had a colostomy bag and things like this. So she just kept going up until the end. But because she didn't come to terms with it or face it, I didn't either. And when she died, it just absolutely floored me. It was a shock. I didn't know she was going to die. And that made my grief so complicated, so anguished. I just wanted to go back and do it over again. I wanted to have these conversations I didn't get to have. I wanted to ask her questions. So much I would have done or wished I could have done. My father's death was so different. He was much older. He was 57 when I was born. And so when he died, when I was 25 years old, he was 83. And he lived a lot of life. He'd been this like incredible World War II fighter pilot and bomber pilot, sorry. And he'd been through prison camp and a long career in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so when it came time, when his cancer really started to get the best of him, he really accepted it. He wanted to go home. He wanted to be with me. He wanted to have hospice. And we really faced his death together. He walked me through it. He at one point sat me down when he was still able to kind of sit around and talk. And he made me write out a list of everything I had to do when he died, like in the hour after he died and in the days following. And I was like, oh my God, Dad, I can't do this. This is so morbid. I was crying. He's like, what's the first thing you have to do? And I was like, I don't know. And he was like, you call the mortuary, and you write an obituary and you have to call Social Security and you have to print. He's like, I recommend at least 7 death certificates, like all these things. And I just was weeping. I was 25 years old. This is not what my peers and friends were doing at this time in their lives. And
I was doing it, Claire.
I know you were. This is why we've been friends for so long.
At exactly 25. Yeah.
And so when he died, I was sitting there with him. I was holding his hand. We had had these beautiful conversations. We had said goodbye to each other. I felt like I had honored his wishes about how he wanted to die. And then I had this little note card. I was there, he died, and I was completely alone. No parents, no siblings, didn't have any family around me. And I felt like it was his last way of fathering me into the world, was helping me see him through his death and myself through his death. But those two very different experiences informed so much of the work I do today. You're right, my mother's death left me just, again, anguished with so much anxiety, sadness, fear, because it was unexpected, the shock of it. It just felt like, oh my gosh, anything bad could happen at any time. And that was something, yeah.
So let me stop you there and reflect upon what we all cannot change. So you cannot change your mother's reaction to her own impending death. You, of course, benefited from your father's reaction to his own pending death. So if we're all sitting here with our own death stories and we can't go back in time and change them, but some of our stories have left us feeling other, alone, anxious. How do you make peace? Or maybe there's no making peace. How do you shift your thinking so you can move forward and feel more whole, despite whatever story you have inherited?
I think there are so many of us that are feeling this and sitting in this kind of loss and grief. And, for me personally, it was a long journey of so many things. I wrote my mother endless letters, just constantly wrote her letters, telling her how sorry I was that I wasn't there, telling her how much I loved her. And it was cathartic because I was walking around through my days holding all of that. I just was walking around with this like constant wanting to talk to her and tell her these things. So writing them out felt really cathartic and powerful. I also did these kinds of meditations. I felt like I needed to, make amends with myself. There was a big piece of self-forgiveness that came here and self-compassion. And that was perhaps some of the hardest work I had to do. I really held myself so accountable and I was so angry with myself and felt so awful about myself that working on this self-compassion and understanding what it means to be human and what it means to love and to lose people was really some of the hardest work. I also found a lot of support in the grief world. That was huge, just to meet people who were also feeling this way and to realize that I wasn't alone in going through something like this. And I wasn't alone in like messing up, like not being there. So that was really helpful. And then various kind of spiritual experiences I've had and sought out have also been part of that journey.
Well, I'm not going to get into this now. It's a whole other subject, but you just referenced like the other things that you've done. One of them, of course, is seeking out what is in the afterlife. You wrote a whole book about it, which I completely recommend, called After This. And you explore mediumship and so many other aspects of connecting with those who have died. If you want to delve into that, please do get Claire's book After This. You will not be sorry. I love it. It's light blue, right? With clouds on the cover and the hardcover. Is it right there behind you? It probably is. But anyway, it's a great book. So I highly recommend it. I do want to talk the different manifestations of anxiety and how they can show up. So for me, I'm a mom. I have 2 children. And when my children were young, I was someone who was really, and still am, by the way, now that they drive, really afraid of the shoe always dropping and that the worst has already happened. My parents have died. And so the way I absorbed that anxiety was being super aware of my children's safety, and not just aware, not taking it for granted, and oftentimes assuming the worst. And so I think the anxiety conversation shows up in many ways. And in this way, you're a mom too. Can you take on this piece of parenting? And does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And with so many of my clients, I think you're right. When we go through something like a big loss, parents, spouses, children, it's, the worst thing has happened. It indeed can happen. So we now have this intrinsic knowledge that terrible things can happen, and we start to see the world through that lens, and we develop a hypervigilance, and it happens so quickly. It's similar to a trauma response, and we just develop this instant hypervigilance, that something else terrible could happen. And if we're kind of trying to prepare for it, if we can think about it before it happens, maybe we will be able to cope or prevent it. So we stay in that state, and we just see everything through that, right? Husband's home late, coming home late from work, you immediately think he's in a car crash, or the kids are going to go for a bike ride in the neighborhood. You only see like an accident happening, and it becomes exhausting. It takes a real toll on us, and it becomes habitual as well. And so we really get stuck in a loop of seeing everything through that lens. So a lot of the work I do with people is really breaking that cycle, breaking those thought patterns, working to develop new thought patterns, ways to pivot from those kinds of anxious, hypervigilant thoughts. Because, you're right, like we get into a real pattern with it. You just kind of see that all the time with children, with anyone you love, or with yourself too. I see a lot of people struggle with a kind of hypochondria, like constantly worrying that there's something wrong with you physically, or you have an illness or cancer. That's a big one as well.
I'm going to get to your book that you wrote, Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. I am certainly going to talk about your book for sure. But the one book I wanted to talk about, just because it came up now as we're talking, I just had like a memory. There's this great book that I read. It's an old book by a guy named Dr. Michael Schwartzman. It was called The Anxious Parent. And
Mm.
what it helped me to do when my kids were so young that they were trying to learn how to walk to school without me hovering, um, it went back to my first question to you actually about imagination. And
Mhm.
and I'm paraphrasing, what he recommended in terms of a practical approach, which I wanted to make sure we're talking about practicality in our call today too, was that instead of me sitting here imagining the worst outcome for my kids getting to school or not getting to school, to try to imagine actually the best outcome. That of
Mhm.
course the phone is not ringing because they got to school okay. And so it forced me to be responsible and proactive with my own thinking. And if my thoughts were going in a pattern where I was assuming the worst, to start steering the ship to imagining positive outcomes. Do you help your clients in that regard? Or is that something that Michael Schwartzman wrote about so long ago and it's no longer applicable?
No, that's exactly what I recommend. And I write a lot about it in the anxiety book. And it's something I started doing for myself, just this kind of reverse thinking. Because, my big fear that I would constantly veer towards was that I was going to get sick and die and leave my children, and that they would be motherless like I was. And so, I would get like a pain in my side and instantly think, oh, it's colon cancer. And then before I even knew it, I'd be in the hospital bed in my mind, picturing it, saying goodbye to my children, this horrible scene. And it would spin me out into anxiety for the rest of the day, which would then, lend to itself to various behaviors from the anxiety. So my work, when I started to really do that, was to catch myself. Sometimes I didn't catch myself till I was like really, in the throes of the hospital scene. And then I'd be like, oh my God, what am I doing? And I would make myself do a reverse scenario. So instead of picturing myself dying at 40, I would imagine being at like my daughter's wedding, 30 years from now. And I would try to picture it with as much detail and emotion as I was doing with the negative fantasy. And it was work, but it began to really shift that thought for me. And it began to take some power away from the anxious thoughts. And so it got to the point where I could have the pain in my side. And instead of getting all the way to that negative fantasy, I could just recognize what was happening and shift away from it. And again, this last piece, always with some self-compassion. I would find myself leaning in towards the anxious thoughts, and I would be like, it's okay, anxious thoughts, but we're going to step away, but really be kind to myself as I did that work.
I think that's really important. For me, my mother died of ovarian cancer. And so my own fear of my own health, I did something incredibly drastic, which worked for me. After I was done having my children, I got a hysterectomy without having cancer because I was much more likely statistically to get ovarian cancer too. I was
Yeah.
also much more likely to get breast cancer because these are linked. And so without having had cancer, maybe there's some women on the call who could relate. And if you want to talk about this outside of this call, I went ahead and had a double mastectomy too. I've written so much publicly about this too, because my fear of early death was because both of my parents had died so young, and also, like you, Claire, from cancer. So I wonder, in terms of agency, what is the power? Is there power that gets us through anxiety that comes with being proactive in whatever way helps you? What is the piece that comes with agency? What
Yeah.
piece comes with agency?
That's a great question. I think it looks different for all of us. You went one route that felt really good and powerful for you. And I think it sounds like, from what I know of all the time I've known you, it was really helpful for you. And it did ease a lot of anxiety and make you feel safe and solid. One of the things I've done for myself is just like a lot of death planning, which was scary for me initially and is sometimes still emotional to do. I, again, updated all my stuff during COVID. And that means like, thinking about, if I were to die tomorrow, what's in place right now? Do I have a will? Will my kids have letters from me? Do they know what kinds of things I want them to have? Is there life insurance? Does my husband know my, bank account passwords? All these things that I felt like that gave me a real sense of peace and agency in terms of being proactive. But it's scary, like I cry as I do it because I don't want to die yet. But again, it does actually calm me down to do those things ultimately.
I was just looking down because I received a message over, it just pinged. And of course, everyone wants to know how to get in touch with Claire Bidwell Smith and Reimagine and Damani. So here I go, putting on my glasses so I can read some URLs. So Claire, you're on Facebook, Claire Bidwell Smith Writes. Instagram, Claire Bidwell Smith. Twitter, Claire Bidwell. So you have three different, they're all kind of related. Reimagine, of course, Let's Reimagine on Instagram, Let's _Reimagine on Twitter, and Reimagine End of Life on Facebook. I know I'm going fast, but you guys know how to find people I know on social. And then Damani for Grief, by the way, on Facebook, it is Damani for Grief Community. They have a community page. So even after we are done today at the strike of 11 Pacific time, you can go on the Damani for Grief Facebook page and continue the conversation. And Damani for Grief is also on Instagram. So with that out of the way, I want to go on to some other questions for you, Claire, which is, you mentioned that you are an only child. And I'm wondering, what does your personal family dynamic, if you're an only child, if you are, if you have a sister, if you have a brother, if for some reason you don't even get along with your siblings, and so they're around, but maybe your relationship is fractured. What do family dynamics and how do they come into play when we are kind of ramping up our feelings of being anxious?
Family dynamics are intense after a loss or around a loss. Everybody grieves differently. Everybody has a different timeline. Everyone has different feelings and reactions. And different relationship. There can be 4 siblings who lose a mom and they all feel it differently. They all had a different relationship with her. They all have different personalities and ways of moving through emotions and sadness. And often there's a lot of friction, and there's often a lot of support, but hand in hand with a lot of friction. And there can be flare-ups and there's so much emotion involved. And I think within families, there's often a lot at stake. There can be property, or somebody needs to be helping take care of, somebody in a facility, or it falls on somebody more than someone else. And so these things happen too. And it does cause an enormous amount of anxiety. I think there's sometimes the feeling of judgment that comes in as well. And you feel like you're not grieving the same way, or you want somebody else to be grieving. It all explodes and plays out in the holidays and death anniversaries, which is really fun for everybody.
So,
But
so what is the solution to that? So is the solution to always bring in kind of a neutral party, not someone that you have to pay for, but like if you're kind of having friction within your family dynamic, what is the bomb? Like, how do you deal with that?
it's not always possible to get through. I mean, it takes the whole family wanting to work on it, wanting to sit down and figure out, how do we do this together as a group? And that's not always a possibility. I think the thing I think is most important is for the individual who's experiencing the friction to find their own source of support outside of the family, so that they feel their own grief process is seen, understood, supported, not by the siblings or family members that maybe don't agree or aren't on the same page. And that looks in the form of, doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a support group. It could be a book you read. It could be podcasts you listen to about grief. Just something that validates, normalizes, and supports your own experience. That way you feel okay if it's not the same as what's happening in your family.
You mentioned a podcast, so perfect segue. Just before I do get to everyone's questions, you're going to be a podcaster professionally soon. What do you have going on, Miss Podcaster?
I have a big podcast launching in September called New Day. There's a teaser up on iTunes already. And it's all about mental health. It's all about kind of how do we come through this collective experience of the pandemic and all the grief we went through and all the ways life has changed, and how do we find ways to make our lives better every day, little ways, big ways. And I'll be talking to all kinds of really fascinating people from all different walks of life. And I'm excited about it.
I can't wait. I can't wait. I can't wait to listen, and I'll wait for my phone to ring. Maybe I'll be a guest someday.
Yes.
I do want to get to your course that you are working on for August 23rd. It launches. It's a 6-week course, once a week, online, virtual, so everyone can take advantage of it. I promised you that there was going to be a way to be a part of an experiment that we're doing with Domani for Grief of texting and getting a discount code, and then of course getting more of the information from Domani for Grief. So we're going to give this a shot today. You guys are our first experiments just for this call. So if you text the word grief to this phone number, 801-893-5733, what you will get is 10% off of Claire's new course. Not course, really. Sorry, I'm misspeaking. It's a support group once a week for 6 weeks beginning August 23rd, but you will get 10% off your ability to participate. So try to do this. Let's have this experiment. It'll be automated. And so you will get back that discount code, and you will get word and information from Domani for Grief too. So again, grief, you text that word grief to 801-893-5733. Let's give it a shot for 10% off. So Claire, I hope that works.
Yeah, I
Domani for
texted it myself just to check it out.
yeah, I hope it works. So in your book, Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief, you do talk about some definitions. And I think before I open it up to questions, I think it's really helpful to define some terms, because anxiety is not just every once in a while worrying about something. Can you discuss how we can understand by definitions if what we're feeling is actual anxiety?
Yeah, anxiety is a slippery creature. I mean, it comes in many forms, in many disguises. So I think it is important to talk about what it is, what it looks like, but it's also so mercurial, like comes in so many different ways. The simple definition of anxiety is that it's fear of something real or imagined. And this comes into play a lot with grief. You know, we have this fear that comes up, and it is about something real that has happened. We have gone through a huge loss. We watched a loved one suffer or die of an illness or an accident, something sudden. That's a very real fear that comes up, that was scary, and that there could be more things like that. But that plays into the imagined part, right? Now we start to imagine all the other kinds of things that could happen, just like we were talking about with children, that kind of anxiety. And so it's this kind of revolving playbook of fear, but it's also as simple as just kind of that feeling of dread in the morning, just like that something isn't right. You know, that's like a very simple feeling of anxiety that a lot of us have. Worry, a constant kind of rumination about worrying about everything, worrying about what time it is and what time, you know, somebody's going to come home or what we're going to make for dinner, just kind of fretting over all kinds of things. I spoke with an anxiety psychiatrist once, and I asked him if it was possible to get rid of anxiety completely. And he laughed at me. He said, no. And I was like, oh no. And he said, no, why would we want to? He said, anxiety serves a purpose. You know, we all have a certain level of anxiety, and it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us, you know, just staying on top of things. Like before you're going to go on a big trip or you're going to give a big talk, you have a certain amount of anxiety that kind of gets you going and keeps you organized. And so it's useful. It's not useful when we get into these hypervigilant states, when we're paralyzed by anxiety, when we're feeling that hypochondria and we think that something's wrong with us, or constantly worrying about loved ones, or we're getting a social phobia, or we're afraid to get on an airplane. Those kinds of anxieties, they're just so exhausting to live with, and they take tolls on us physically and emotionally and on our lives and our loved ones. I saw somebody in the chat, I glanced at it, that asked, like, how do your spouses deal with your anxiety? You know, just even the people in our relationships around us who have to manage our anxiety or be around for it. It's hard. It takes a big toll. And so, you know, the anxiety it's an interesting thing. One of the last things I'll say about it is that it's something that can be hidden very well, which I think is one of the reasons that makes it kind of slippery. Somebody can have anxiety and you don't even know it. Sometimes people's anxiety is very obvious, but other people, you know, somebody can be feeling anxious and you would have no idea. They're standing right before you having a conversation or giving a presentation or teaching a class, and they're anxious inside and not outside. So it's something that people often grapple with on their own without talking about it and thinking that it's something they just have to deal with or it's something wrong with them. And so I think the more we can discuss it and point different ideas at it, the more that we can work through it.
Or label them and feel that you have the power to name what we're going through so we can get the support that we need. And I feel like if there's anything with the new conversation in regard to Simone Biles, right, we're talking about the Olympics, is that these conversations are now percolating to the very top of the news cycle. And so hopefully people will feel more permission to vocalize their own experiences for themselves.
Mhm.
I want to pivot. It's 1:40 here in New York, and so I want to make sure we're leaving ample time to answer your questions. And so I'm going to toss the baton to Christina, who's been monitoring the chat this whole time and can maybe help us with some questions.
Sure. So the first one is private. It says, how do you handle back to back loss such that you never really feel like you got a chance to finish with your grief, even before the next one hits?
Oh, that's a hard one. I hear about this from time to time, experiencing multiple losses within a year or a few years. And it's hard because I think that you're right. You kind of can't catch your breath in between them, and you don't have time to finish grieving for someone. Not that we're ever finished grieving, but you haven't really like sat with your grief for someone before you get hit with another one. And so in that case, it ends up feeling like this big, giant grief and this big, giant trauma that's happened to you. I think it is important to start to tease apart those losses. I think there's a grief we have to do for the overall, like that all this loss has happened in your life all at once. But then it's important to try to sit individually with each loss. And that really can't come until you've kind of gotten a little bit stable. I mean, it's hard to go through so much all at once, but once you're in a place where you can start to really sit with maybe the loss of a father for a little bit, and what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how is it playing out in your life? And then move on to perhaps the friend who also died that year and sit with that loss and where that's affecting you. You can do this individually. You could do this with a therapist. You could do this in different support groups. You could attend a support group for that particular kind of loss. So you could be working through father loss in a support group like that, and then going into the other ones. But I do think it's important to find some kind of support through it, because it's a lot of loss at once is a lot to handle.
Next question is from Lauren. Can you speak on what it's like to lose roles that have been central to identity and even functioning? I'm no longer a daughter, a sister, or a niece. And this hollows, these losses make me feel like I've lost part of myself and who I will be going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a lot of identity shifts in grief and loss. I think that kind of, yeah, losing those roles as a daughter, as a partner, as a parent, are incredibly difficult. And because they're based on love, I think when our identity changes, maybe through career or sense of place, that's one thing. But to have our identity change through a loving relationship or a familial relationship, it's really hard to kind of figure out, who are we? I think it's important to remember that we are still always a daughter, a partner. I think we're always still in relation with the people that we lose. I think we have internal relationships with them. I think we have spiritual relationships with them. I still consider myself a daughter, even though I don't have kind of the regular daughterly duties that you might have, but I still think of myself as a daughter. I still think of myself who carries my parents' legacy, who embodies the things that were important to them, and that I bring that forward into the world. So I think there are ways to kind of retain pieces of that identity. Allison, you talk about this kind of thing so much in your books. What do you have to say with this one?
Yeah, I relate to it, having lost both of my parents so relatively young, and I feel that I need to create opportunity to be a daughter. And what I mean by that is making a point to bring up my parents in conversation and actually say their name out loud. And when I speak to purposefully and proactively, when I reach out to people who knew my parents to say, hey, this is Allison, Lynn's daughter calling. I make those conversations happen because boy, do I miss saying that, right? It's Lynn's daughter calling. It's Lynn's daughter calling. It's fun to be able to say my name in relationship to my mom. And so I feel like, again, going back to the proactivity piece, that's really important. The one thing I want to mention before Christina goes on to the next question, I saw in the chat that there was a hunger for more practical advice about how to deal with anxiety when it comes to grief and loss. And I want to recap what Claire has already shared. Maybe you've joined late, and maybe Claire can pick up a few ideas from here if I've left anything out or if you want to add. So one thing that Claire has already spoken about, she was doing a Q&A and has done a Q&A this month in July for CNN.com. And she talks a little bit about, and we explained it a little bit more, about the power of our own imagination to recreate story. That was one idea. Claire also talked about the power of letter writing, that you wrote a lot of letters to your mom after she died. One book that you guys may want to pick up that's really strong in that regard is by Dr. Robert Niemeyer. He talks a lot about the power of letter writing post a grief experience. Claire also talked about meditation, which is also very powerful, and journaling. And of course, maybe Christina, we can throw this up again. There's a new support group that Claire Bidwell Smith has that's beginning on August 23rd, not October, August 23rd. It's 6 weeks. It's once a week. Anyone can participate. And we have a code that we are offering just this group today. We've never done the texting before, but this is the course and this is the code. Just text the word grief to that number, 801-893-5733, to get 10% off and also to be added to Domani for Grief's list, so we can get you more information and more support. And so the chat wanted more practical tips. I've just recounted the ones that I can remember right off the top of my head. Claire, before I go on to the next question with Christina's help, can you maybe talk about one more practical tip if folks are really struggling with some anxious thinking?
Yeah, there's so many. I think one quick one that would be great is just mindfulness. When we are going through grief and anxiety, we're spending a lot of time in the future worrying about things that haven't happened yet, potentially may never happen. We're also spending a lot of time in the past reviewing what has happened and what we did wrong or what we wish we could go back and do. So bringing your attention to the present moment with mindfulness techniques is a really quick and easy way to just decrease some anxiety. But there's a lot of cognitive stuff I recommend. I wrote everything I know about grief and anxiety in this book. I just put it all in. Everything I've done in all my work in the last decade is in that book. And I'm excited about the support group. I run support groups all the time, but usually they're general grief for 6 weeks. And I do 1 week about anxiety. This is 6 weeks. So we're going to dive into every single kind of aspect and all these different tools.
I think it's so important. I'm so glad that you are doing this. Again, it starts in late August, so please check it out. If the
And I just want to say, like, I'm
Yeah.
never trying to like hawk stuff. Like I wrote all this and created all this because I went through it myself, and I see so many people struggling with it. Anxiety and grief is what I see more than anything, and it breaks my heart to see someone debilitated and paralyzed from it. So I'm constantly trying to just put as much out there. My husband's always like, there's only one of you, Claire. And I'm like, I know. So I'm writing books and I'm doing podcasts and courses so I can help as many people as I can.
Is the message, though, that it's preventable?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not preventable. I actually think it's not. I think we often just develop it without even realizing when we go through a big loss, but it's absolutely possible to get on top of it, to decrease it incredible amounts. I now still will kind of see the lens through a little bit of fear or catastrophe, but never in the way that I used to. I'll have that thought like, oh, husband's home late, he's gone. And then I'll be like, okay, anxiety, move on, keep making dinner, whatever it is I'm doing. And it just doesn't take over my life. And so I think that is the real goal.
Can I share my milestone? So I have 2 drivers in my house, children, and they're older and they're now in college. And so I'm just letting you know my personal victory is that now that they're home, we had to reestablish what are the guidelines for them coming home on a weekend night. How late is too late? Do they have a curfew? They're in college. They don't have a curfew because we're not there, but they're home. And so I get worried. And it's only recently where I've been able, this is true, to fall asleep comfortably before they come home. And that's been a work in progress.
That's a big one. Yeah, I'm headed into that territory myself. You're gonna have to call you.
That's a work in progress. Okay, Christina, back to you. Sorry about that.
This question is from Dan. How do you deal with ongoing grief for a beloved longtime partner after you fall in love again and are very connected to your new love?
Oh, yeah. I think that I love this saying that I've been using for many years, that 2 things can be true at once. You can still love and miss your partner that died, and you can also be in deep relationship and love with your current partner. And I think that have to take away the idea that you have to maybe pick one, that you can really have both. And maybe you feel them at the same time. Maybe you spend time in communion, whether it's in ritual or spiritual ways or meditation with your loved one that died. And then maybe you really spend focused time with your new person. Or maybe you're just feeling it all together. Maybe you incorporate things about your first relationship into the new relationship with your partner who's hopefully up for that. And I just, I think there's so much beauty. I think one of the things that we get to do as humans is love. And so never making that something that, you're hard on yourself about. How amazing that you have so much love and have gotten to love so much.
My favorite word is only 3 letters, and,
Mm,
A-N-D.
yeah.
It is so possible, as you just said so beautifully, to have both. And the magic of life is that it's sad and happy, right? That you can kind of go down these parallel paths. And so if there's one 3-letter word to take from today's call, maybe it's the word and.
Mhm. I love that.
What else do you have, Christina?
How do you manage the jealousy and longing for your deceased parents, specifically listening to friends talk about how much help they're getting from their living parents?
Oh man, Allison and I can probably both talk on this for hours. I've definitely been through it. Watching my friends, their moms come to school to pick up my friends' kids, or even in-laws, my mother-in-law, or how those things feel, just watching my husband get to have parents. It's a hard one. It took me a long time to come to peace with it, and it still flares up here and there. I think it's okay. I think it's normal. I think when it's taking a toll on relationships or, preoccupying you, then it's not good. It needs a little work. But what I have found most healing is to find friends who know what it feels like. So I can call Allison and be like, oh my God, I got so jealous today at that school pickup, whatever it is. And she will totally get it. And it makes me feel so much better. And it makes me feel seen and understood. You can't, change it, but you can make yourself feel supported. What about you, Allison?
I think having a posse on text is really important. That if you're in the moment, you've already identified someone who will be a receptive sounding board.
Mhm.
Here's a concrete example using this, story about anger, jealousy, resentment, things like that. If I were to text that, let's say that moment to, let's say, my own brother, I love him. Fabulous guy. Awesome. He would not be receptive to that text. That's not what he wants to talk about. It's not what he wants to hear. He wouldn't be the perfect person to text in that moment. And that would just set me up. I've learned the hard way that I would then feel further alienated because I chose the wrong person to vent to, talk with. And so part of our job, I believe, is being proactive in choosing those people who are our grief friends.
Mhm.
And so if you could identify those people or that one person, and again, for me, it's not within my own family. I love my brother. We're close, but it's still not him. And so to give yourself permission to look beyond maybe the obvious folks. And so when you do have that jealous pang, then you can text someone who is your grief friend and who will make you feel a little bit stronger in that moment.
Yeah. Perfect advice.
Christina, I think we have time for 3 more questions.
Yeah, Allison, I'm wondering if you could talk more about siblings handling grief differently, because I got a few questions about that.
Yeah, so my brother is my older brother. He has always been the cerebral one, the business one. I'm much more of the freewheeling artist one, wear my heart on my sleeves one, the writer one. And so we come out the world from very different vantage points. And it took me, I'm sorry to admit it, it took me a few years of not getting back from my own brother what I needed, to realize that it's okay for me to get what I need from somebody else. And that doesn't mean my brother misses my parents any less. And it doesn't mean my brother doesn't love me. It just means that I don't go to him like I don't go to my kids for certain things, or my husband for certain things, or, you have friends for different outings. Not all your friends like to go ice skating. I'm making it up. So you choose those people in your life for certain reasons. And I think for siblings too, it's really important to ultimately acknowledge and accept what your siblings can do with you, for you, and what we hope they could do that they won't. And once we separate hope from reality, I feel like there's peace.
Next question is from Marcia. She says, much of my grief has been manifesting in anger towards others. My hurt comes out as anger. I'm working on ways to express my anger productively and not push people away. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, anger is a powerful emotion. I think sometimes we lean into it when we're grieving because it feels more powerful. Sadness, depression, fear, those things are heavier. They slow us down. They're hard to deal with. And so anger can be this kind of fueling force. But I always think that underneath anger, if you peel up the lid of anger, there's always sadness and fear lurking there. And so what I try to do when I find myself really angry at someone or something is I think, what is it that I'm hurting about? What is it that I'm scared of here? And then I really try to work with those two things. And usually that helps dissipate the anger. Allison, what do you do with anger?
Yeah, is yelling and screaming, is that not what you're talking about? No.
It's great to do
Yelling,
that too. I mean,
screaming,
hit a
throwing
mattress with a
pots and
broom,
pans.
whatever.
Yeah, apologizing to my children. No, I'm kidding. I agree with everything that you said. I have nothing to add to that. I think what you've done is summarize it perfectly. What I do want to say in the remaining moments that we have is I personally don't want just the hour to end. And if you would like to continue the conversation, there are multiple ways to do that. If you're feeling like your question wasn't answered today, fine. Of course, we can't get to every question in the chat. There's 3 ideas. One is that Damani for Grief has a Facebook community. Please go there, talk, sign up, vent, rage, commiserate, share ideas that work. Claire Bidwell Smith, as I mentioned, is on Facebook. She's on Instagram. She's on Twitter. There are 3 different similar addresses, but you can find her. Claire Bidwell Smith writes, Claire Bidwell Smith, and Claire Bidwell. That's Facebook, that's Instagram and Twitter. I'm on social media too. A Gilbert writer pretty much everywhere. And so please don't end the conversation here. I always feel so odd to kind of have this time-bound conversation and then have it just be over and then we all go back to our own lives. And so please do avail yourself to keeping the conversation going. And Christina, you have one more chance, lightning round, quick question, one more for Claire.
Sure. So this person attends all these events, goes to counseling journals, but she still feels like an endless longing and yearning for her deceased mother. And she wants to know, will that ever go away? Or what can I do about it?
I don't know if that ever goes away. I still miss my mother every day, and I don't think it should go away necessarily. I think it's something we learn to live with and to work with and to incorporate into our days. Hope Edelman had a beautiful book come out last year called The After Grief, which I highly recommend. And in that book, she really talks about how grief plays out through our whole lifetimes and different ways to move with it and different ways to incorporate it. So I really recommend that book.
I do too. It's a white book and has these blue waves on the cover. If you want a visual, if you're going onto an online site to go look for it, that's the visual that you would see. So The After Grief, and the author is Hope Edelman, who is a dear friend of both Claire's and mine. So Reimagine, I thank you. Damani for grief. I thank you, of course, to Christina. Thank you for so ably going through the chat. And Claire, thank you for joining us from your new home in California. We have 3,000 miles between us on this Zoom, and I feel like you're right here with me, and I miss you. And I think you're just fantastic. And thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. Thank you, Damani. Thank you, Reimagine, and to all of you guys who came today. Wishing
All right,
you lots of
it is
love
the
and
top
peace.
of the hour as promised. Thank you again, and please find us, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you.